Welcome in, everybody. We'll be getting started soon, and I want to thank those who came out to support our program today. If you have any questions during the program, please feel free to type any questions into the chat. We'll have a space to type those in at the bottom. If you scroll down and have a YouTube account, you'll be able to type in where I've already posted welcome in. So please ask any questions you might have there, and I'll do my best to answer them. Whoops, sorry, had a bit of an internet hiccup there. Hopefully it's all working fine. Thank you, and welcome to our In Your Neighborhood program on the Queen's Pride Parade. My name is Jaron Halfpap, and I want to give you a quick introduction into a fixture of the Queen's LGBT community for the last 30 years. On June 28, 1969, the Stonewall Riots took place. This was a spontaneous demonstration by the LGBT community in New York City, where members of the community were literally fighting for the right to exist. At this time, there was a lot of anti-homosexual legislation and social sentiment. What sparked this demonstration was a police raid. The Stonewall Inn was being used by the LGBT community as a gay bar, something that was, on paper, illegal. As the LGBT community had fewer rights than their straight counterparts, who could go into bars to socialize, the police would target these gay bars and raid them, frequently harassing the patrons as they invaded their privacy and made arrests. Stonewall that night was different, because the people were tired of this prosecution, and it quickly escalated into a full-blown revolt against the police that sought to oppress them. Groups the police had been frequently targeting came to join in on the violence, which escalated and ended up lasting 2 days. This event served more as a rallying call for LGBT activism and an opportunity to show a united strength and activism. Following the event, activist groups capitalized on the idea of fighting back against the systems, and organizations like the Gay Liberation Front and Gay Activists Alliance were founded. For the 1-year anniversary of the Stonewall Riot, a parade was organized, and on June 28, 1970, 3,000 to 5,000 people or more marched in a show of visibility and defiance. This parade went from Sheridan Square to Sheep's Meadow in Central Park, about 51 blocks. This parade still operates annually today and is one of the largest pride parades in the world. But it is by no means the only one here in New York City. Queens has its own pride parade that is independently run from the one in Manhattan, and it has its own history and purpose as well. I want to show you the Lavender Line and what it is like to attend one of Queens's great celebrations of LGBT pride. After Stonewall, Queens was still distinct from Manhattan and did not have the same level of activism within. I would especially like to thank Councilmember Daniel Drum, one of the founders of the Queens Lesbian and Gay Pride Committee, for taking the time to talk with me about the history of the parade and what went into making it happen.
Queens did have some activism in the 1970s. There was an organization called Gay Activists of Queens County, I believe, and they met in the Unitarian Church in Flushing. I did at one time pull a flyer for the meeting that they were having from the New York Public Library. So it's in that collection. When I did an exhibit at the Queens Library, I did an exhibit in the Queens Library in 1994, I believe it was, a little bit on the history of the LGBT movements in Queens. So that organization existed. And then around about 77 or 78, another organization called Dignity, which was a group for gay Catholics, met again at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Flushing. And they were there right up until the start of the Queen's Pride Parade in 1991 and maybe a little bit, or 1993. And then they were there a little bit after, but then it ended. And that was run by a guy named Bill Foote, Foote. He lives in Elmhurst. And I would go to those meetings. I was there at the initial meetings, but I had just graduated college, so I wasn't really one of the organizers, but did go to Mass. We had masses, Catholic masses with priests back then. And then I moved to Jackson Heights, and I found out there were a couple of groups in Jackson Heights called Gay and Lesbian Pack, and they met in a club called Breadsticks in Forest Hills. And Wendy Moscow was a member of that organization, but I don't believe that they did endorsements, but they did have some political, they did some political work. Then there was another group in Jackson Heights called the Gay Friends and Neighbors of Jackson Heights. And they met in people's apartments in Jackson Heights. And that, I believe, was mostly a social organization. And that was like in the mid-1980s or so. But what really galvanized the community was the murder of Julio Rivera. And that's when Ed Cedarbaum started Queens Gays and Lesbians United. Also known as QGLU, was the predecessor to the Queens Lesbian and Gay Pride Committee.
Discrimination and violence was rampant against the community, which required the community to not be open about who they were to avoid violence. In Queens, one of these places to be was Jackson Heights. Jackson Heights' status as an LGBT neighborhood has origins going back to the 1920s. Because it was along the subway, many Broadway performers who worked in Manhattan could afford to live in Jackson Heights. Jackson Heights bars were also gay-friendly and allowed them to mingle there, despite the risks that we previously mentioned.
Stories about it being a mecca for LGBT people because of its close proximity to Manhattan and a lot of show people coming to Jackson Heights that live in Jackson Heights. And still, in many ways, Jackson Heights is a large artist community, and a number of journalists live in Jackson Heights as well. So I think that that's where it got its reputation. But, you know, if you jump on the E or the F into Manhattan, or even the number 7, you can be in Manhattan in 15 to 20 minutes. So I think that's really why that was. But for sure, I was there in 1973, and we had 3 or 4 gay bars then in the neighborhood, and it was quiet, but it was known in the community, but it just really wasn't spoken about too much until the parade happened.
One of the key moments in LGBT history in Queens was the murder of Julio Rivera. On July 2nd, 1990, Julio was brutally attacked by 3 skinheads out looking to bash gays. Julio died of his injuries. This was only the latest death of at least a dozen previous gay men in the neighborhood, none of which had been investigated or prosecuted. Julio's death was swept aside by the NYPD, who refused to call it a hate crime. Through community action from the family and the LGBT community, political action was taken, and eventually enough attention was given to the case to have it reclassified as a hate crime, and a reward was put out for the rest of the attackers. Eventually, they were arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced. While attempting to get the crimes, and others like it, to be recognized as hate crimes, there were coordinated efforts to protest the lack of action. Specifically, phone calls were placed to the 115th Police Precinct to distract them while marchers went from Jackson Heights to the Governor's House and Gracie Mansion. The murder, and the difficulty of obtaining justice, became a rallying cry, and the LGBT community knew that it needed to advocate for itself more in Queens. Queens Gay and Lesbians United was formed in response. This came at an important time when Jackson Heights had been redistricted to have its own representative. Ed Cedarbaum had coordinated candidate nights to make sure that LGBT issues were part of platforms of potential candidates. Because of the popularity of this, a sign-up sheet was passed around to this activist audience, and almost 20 people showed up to early meetings of what would become QGLU. Being one of the first organizations of its kind in Queens, QGLU played an important part in early LGBT activity in Queens. This organization popped up even in the face of the secretiveness many people kept as a way of staying safe. It was a place to discuss ways to be active and share things about people in the community. According to Ed, it was about having a community of themselves with a sense of ownership and even safety. With the rise of citywide issues, such as the Children of the Rainbow curriculum, it was very important for LGBT people to be visible and fight for their ability to be seen as part of the greater community. The Children of the Rainbow curriculum would add educational resources that included diverse family types and included material that showed explicitly homosexual family dynamics as being normalized. This curriculum was adopted in all but 5 of the school districts in New York City. However, Jackson Heights District 24 was not one of them, thanks in large part to the efforts of Mary Cummins, the school board president. With the controversy surrounding the Rainbow curriculum and anti-gay protests around it, things started to happen. First, a teacher, Daniel Drum, came out publicly in response to the rejection of the Rainbow curriculum. Drum came to QGLU wanting to start an organized parade to encourage visibility. QGLU and Drum decided it would be best to organize it separate from QGLU, and the Queens Pride Committee was created, and Maritza Martinez was also comprised of the board. This parade was important to the activists as a way of promoting visibility. It was important to show that the LGBT community included everyday people throughout the community. Your butcher, your friend, your banker, your sibling, your teacher, all people seen in their everyday lives were also capable of love. Being visible was not easy. Like I mentioned before, being secretive was one way of staying safe. As Ed Cedarbaum said it, some people found safety in hiding, but hiding gets you treated like a criminal. There would be safety in official recognition and constituency. But for the parade to happen, it would take funding and support. Parades require planning, coordination, and money to pay for security and materials.
The Unitarian Church obviously lent us headquarters to meet, and that was really important. That was in Flushing. Claire Shulman, who was the borough president, was actually supportive of the organization and of the formation of the parade, even though she didn't herself march. So she eventually allowed us to meet in Queensborough Hall groups. Also, some of the Latino groups, like the Society de Puertorriqueña de Queens, was very supportive of the organization. Julio Rivera was Puerto Rican, and they understood and they connected the messages between him being gay and being Latino, and they lent us a lot of support as well. Women like Betsy Davila, Luz Colon, they were very supportive in the early days of the formation of the organization. But the bars were instrumental. So what we had to do was, and that's what made the big difference. We got into the bars, we met all of the bar owners, and we hit them up for donations. One of the best bar owners, of course, was Eddie Valentine. He's still involved, and he was the owner of Friends Tavern. And at that time, another bar called Atlantis, and then eventually a third bar called Montana Saloon, now called the Music Box. And he gave us some of our first amounts of funding, $2,500. Another organization was the AIDS Center of Queens County. They gave us $1,500. So we desperately needed that money. But just in regard to the bars, we would go into the bars at about 11 o'clock at night when people had a few drinks in them. And we would tell them that we're starting the Queens Pride Parade. And they would look at us like, you got to be kidding. This is not going to work here in the borough of Queens. This is Archie Bunker land, But they had a few drinks that they'd throw $1 into the coffee can we were carrying with us. And we raised money that way by going from bar to bar to bar on multiple nights. And we made announcements. We put up posters. And so those bars were instrumental in getting us out. And they were also instrumental in convincing people to turn up and to show up for the parade. Not only just for the contributions that they made financially, but also assuring people that they would come and have a good time and that it would be safe.
Security would be important. As marginalized groups, there were plenty of people who still wished violence upon the LGBT community. To get this funding, organizers needed to canvass the Jackson Heights community for that support. Among the first to pledge their support were the bars of Jackson Heights. Many were gay-friendly and were a social spot for LGBT people in the area. The Queen's Pride Committee would go around the town with a coffee can to help collect funds from the patrons who believed in the cause after a few drinks. This helped raise the money needed for the event. Even some of the bars and other local businesses sponsored the event. Friends Tavern and Hatfields donated $2,500 each. Eventually, they raised the funds and were able to go forward.
For the LGBT community, the bars were the only place where we could go to meet, and so bar life for LGBT people was different and still is in some ways different than for non-LGBT people. It's almost like a gay church to that extent, It's a place where we could go and be ourselves and feel safe inside those gay bars. And it was an organizing point for us as well, to get people to actually march in the Queen's Pride Parade. So the history of Friends Tavern is very important to us because, as I say, they were the main supporters, the main bar supporters of the first Pride Parade, and everyone since.
With the start of the parade on June 6th, 1993, Queens finally had its own platform of visibility for LGBT folks. Marching along the lavender-colored line they had put down on the parade route along 37th Avenue from 89th Street to 75th Street. The parade stops at the Elm Jack Mall, where it culminates in more of a block party-style celebration. This route is still the one used today. As the parade turns the corner into Elm Jack Mall with Wink the Penguin protecting it, we connect with 37th Road. This small road behind the businesses was a popular spot for the LGBT community. Due to its proximity to the strip of bars and businesses, it was nearby, but private enough to function as a cruising spot, according to those who remember its reputation. Along this route are some important markers of the history that brought this parade together. The route passes in front of PS 69, the site of Julio Rivera's murder. The corner of 78th and 37th Avenue commemorates him. The next block over is the Edgar Garcon corner, named after another victim of hate-motivated murder in 2001. He had been coming home after a night at the Friends Tavern and was attacked very near the location that Julio Rivera was beaten to death. Not far from the route, at Broadway and 77th Street, is Guillermo Vasquez corner. Guillermo was an early activist for LGBT issues in Queens and was involved with Q-Glue, the Anti-Violence Project, and helped coordinate the first Pride Parade. He died in 1996. The parade was a success, allowing LGBT people a new platform for visibility in Queens. However, it was not without its detractors. A handful of people did protest the parade, and some groups denounced it. The Guardian Angels group in New York City was among that group. However, many of these protests did not withstand Pride's persistence and dissipated over the years. Thankfully, the support has only grown.
There was a man called Paul Morrissey who ran the Morality Action Committee. Believe it or not, that was the name of his organization. And that was based out of Jackson Heights. And just about a day or two before the first Pride Parade, we had a lavender line painted down the middle of 37th Avenue, similar to what they do on 5th Avenue for the Gay Pride Parade there, and also for St. Patrick's Day in Manhattan. Well, when Paul Morrissey saw the lavender line being painted, he came out with a big broom and a bottle of Lestoil and tried to erase the lavender line off of the length of 37th Avenue. My friend Alan Sack was in Ricky's Cafe. He saw that happening and he called the police and they stopped him. But he did show up 2 days later to protest the parade. There are photographs. Richard Spuntoff has photographs of those opponents of the parade calling us sodomites and child molesters and, the whole thing that they used to always do and sometimes still do. So they were there. And they only came, they only lasted maybe 3 or 4 years into the parade, but I did receive death threats on a number of occasions. And for the first Pride Parade, we had to line the rooftops of the apartment buildings along the parade route with sharpshooters and a helicopter escort to be sure that the parade would be safe. The one thing I didn't want to happen was that there would be a violent incident and then nobody would return the next year, because I wanted the movement to continue annually as it has for the most part, except for COVID.
From the initial support from community sponsors with bars and businesses, the parade committee was able to start finding more and more support from more corporate sponsors, allowing the parade to continue into a yearly fixture of the community. The community has also grown in its support for the local event, with many shops showing symbols of pride in the neighborhood, some even throughout the year. Walking around Jackson Heights under the subway and along 37th Avenue, you will see bars with rainbows, restaurants with flags in the windows, shops with signs out. And when you attend the parade itself, you can see a whole Queens community come out in support of the LGBT community here. Distinct from the Manhattan Parade, not only in scale, with the Queens Parade being much more small in scale, but also with a more intimate community relationship. The Queens Pride Parade is itself a slice of Queens, diverse in its marchers and attendees. With the introduction of the Queens Pride Parade, did you ever have this worry that it would be overshadowed by the Manhattan Pride Parade, or did they exist in two different spaces?
Well, that's a really great question. Actually, the Manhattan Pride Parade organization at that time called Heritage of Pride, which was a change from its original Christopher Street Liberation Day Parade Committee, or March Committee, I think, helped us. They lent us all of their papers, their registration papers, and they showed me how to go about, registering groups and working with the police department and what the cost might be. I was a member of the center, the Manhattan LGBT Community Services Center Orientation Committee. And what we would do in those days is bring all the groups into the center on a specific night, and they were allowed to distribute information and stuff like that and talk about what their organization did. And I took that opportunity to get the word out to people that we were trying to start a pride parade in Queens. And by the way, we wanted to have a very happy mixture there of politics and party, because people were nervous, especially behind the murder of Julio Rivera, about how the parade would be, accepted or rejected in the community. But what was really interesting is that, especially with Latino folks in the neighborhood, they identified with the issue of discrimination and realized that Julio was killed because he was gay, but yes, it could have been as well because he was Latino. So there was a real identification with that.
Over time, Queens has grown more and more diverse, and that is reflected in the Pride Parade as well. This diversity has grown over time, but people of color has always been at the root of Pride.
I think the parade of today is a much more inclusive parade in many different ways. I think that the diversity of Queens Pride is one of the things that attracts people to it, but it's become more diverse. I represent Jackson Heights and Elmhurst in the city council. 40% of my community is Latino. The other 40% is Asian. But within those Latino and Asian groups, we have all the little subgroups. So for Latino, you got Colombian, Ecuadorian, Bolivian. And for the Asian, you have South Asian, you have Bangladesh, you have India. They weren't always represented in the Pride Parade. But as the years went on and people felt more secure, the numbers grew, and then you began to see the diversity grow there as well.
Obviously, with the challenges of COVID-19 and the impact it has had on our community, things have had to change to accommodate safety. In June of 2020, the parade itself had to be canceled, marking the first year that had been interrupted since its inception. Understandably, this was a sad moment for those looking forward to it, but it was a necessary step. And as New York approaches high levels of vaccination, people's safety is still number one. And so the 2021 parade had also been canceled. However, Pride is a concept, and the LGBT community continued to come together with virtual events as they waited until it was safe for everybody to meet back up in person. Here's looking forward to Pride 2022. And when we do come back together, we can see how the community has changed. Pride is about making sure that the LGBT community is not pushed back into the shadows of society, where they can be stripped of rights. It's still an ongoing fight for complete rights, especially for people in areas not as accepting as Jackson Heights, Queens, or New York City. Pride is also a way of showing them support as well. It's been a long journey, and I can only scratch the surface for people to learn about the long and difficult road to get to where we are today. I would especially like to thank Douglas DiCarlo, Soraya Ciego Lemur, and Richard Lieberman at the LaGuardia and Wagner Archives for their kind access to the LGBT archive collection. I'd also like to thank Councilmember Daniel Drum for his insight on the history and his contributions to the Queen's Pride Parade. I'd like to thank Ed Cedarbaum from QGlue for talking with me as well. And I'd also like to thank Richard Spuntoff for his continued support and resources to the Queens Historical Society. If you'd like to see more, I implore you to check out Richard's film on Julio Rivera, Julio of Jackson Heights. All right. I want to thank everybody for coming out to today's program. That is the end of our In Your Neighborhood presentation. So if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them. Otherwise, I'd like to thank everybody for coming out and have happy Pride. But I also want to take this moment to highlight a couple of upcoming programs that we have. This August, and on August 7th, we'll be having our Sacred Sites Tour, where we'll be highlighting different sacred locations and places of worship around here in Flushing, one of the birthplaces of religious tolerance. Queens Historical Society is at the Kingsland Homestead is now also open for tours, and we'll be doing walk-in tours hopefully soon, starting in July. So please take a look at getting tickets for right now, but also please consider checking us out. We have 2 exhibits up right now, Capturing Queens and an exhibit on the Gibson Girl. So look forward to checking those out. And I think that wraps up everything that I have. But thank you guys for coming out.